what I've learned from Bev is how to create some time to think, some space for curiosity and conversation, and making connections, joining dots.
Fabulous, thank you very much. So, I am going to share a story with you today. If you bear in mind the story that I'm telling, if you think about your own situations and challenges that you're facing into at the moment, what I'm hoping is that there'll be some things that I say that will make you think, that will be similar or extremely different to what you're facing into, that will make you want to write down a note so that you remember, or pose a question. So if you want to pose a question in the chat, that's fine. And I'll try and go at such a pace that I pause and I'll pause and have a look at the questions, or we might just save them to the end, or Martin might gesture wildly that I should stop because there's a question that's really pertinent to where I am in the story. And what I'm hoping is to sort of bring this story to life. It's a real thing that's happened with a client over the last 2 or 3 months. And I thought it was such a great example of how big picture worked for me, and there were lots of surprises for me in here, even though I'm a practitioner and I've been using big picture for about 10 years, it turns out. So there were some nice surprises in there for me about the impact on people of this. And it's not just about big picture, it's about how to create an environment where people can think really well for themselves and what happens when you do that. So I'm hoping that there's loads of value in there, but I'll leave it to you to decide what that value is, because you know your own situation and you know what's going to be relevant to you. So this is the big picture template, and actually this was a solution that I worked on in the digital space, so there was no element of this that was face to face. But what I will say is we didn't start here. We didn't start with big picture. So it was a really typical scenario where the client came to me and said, I think you can help us with something, and we think we need some sales training. But actually that's not what I delivered in the end. I'm not a sales training expert, because the client was really open to the possibility of thinking differently about the problem. And the problem that we're trying to solve was that they really wanted to strengthen their client relationships. So this is a workforce of around 1,800 people. They provide business services to their clients in the healthcare sector, and they're really successful, but they wanted to future-proof their organisation. And they thought that the solution initially was to create some sales training and put people through that sales training so that people could feel confident about selling services to their clients, so that they could cross-sell from different services and different departments within the organisation, and have the courage to have difficult conversations with clients around the service that they were delivering, and also understand what the service was that they were actually delivering in the first place. So that's what they wanted to do, strengthen client relationships, and they thought sales training might be the answer. But when we huddled around and had a conversation about what they were trying to do, it became really apparent that there was a lot of expertise in the organisation already, and teaching people to sell was just the wrong message. And so we opted for a big picture approach where we huddled round this board together and had a series of conversations that allowed us to explore what the client experience was like and how everybody played a part in it. So there were some specific outcomes around getting a shared view of the client experience, and agreeing how to improve customer service as well. But also there were some things about how do we listen to each other, how do we make sure that we're super interdependent as a team of people so that we can confidently recommend and offer each other's services and skills. And how can we make sure that the relationships we have with our clients are enduring relationships that are more like partnerships than anything else. So there were some trigger words that they said that made me choose big picture as the solution, because I don't use big picture for everything that I do, but in this particular case it just struck me it was the perfect solution, so I introduced them to it. Now then, next up, I had to create some artful questions. So the key to the success of this, I think, has been around shaping questions that got people to think really carefully about their experiences. So questions happened at the groundwork or the pre-work stage. So everybody who was chosen as a participant, and there were 38 people that took part, and there were 6 separate conversations involving 6, 7 or 8 of those participants at a time. So we shared with them some rules of engagement. This is how we need to behave with each other in order to have a really great conversation. We shared some inspiration just in the form of a TED talk. And I posed some questions to get them thinking beforehand so that people were coming to the session really warmed up for the experience they were going to have. And earlier on, when we were just waiting for everyone to arrive, I was commenting that even though we told people this was going to be a conversation, people still expected it to be a training event. And so it was really important that we kept going back with the other groups and repositioning it and making sure that they were clear that they were coming to participate. So this wasn't a situation where it was a flip-top head thing where we were just going to fill their head with information about how to have better relationships with clients. It was very much about uncovering what they knew through a series of really great questions. But there weren't that many questions as it happened. So we asked questions about how you excel already with your client. We asked questions about where you sit in this picture that you can see on the screen. We asked a question about what's the experience like when you walk through it as a customer, and what truth is missing. So I think they were the 4 questions that we asked that guided the entire conversation. So thinking about those questions up front and shaping and reshaping them before we put them live in the room was really beneficial, because we knew we had the right questions, and actually they did get tweaked as we went through based on the quality of the responses and what it triggered in people's thinking. So next up is this one. So the first question, I said it was about where do you excel? So I asked people to think about, in the customer's eyes, think about the work that you do and where do you excel? What do they say about you? And what was really interesting was that people found it quite difficult to comfortably describe where they felt that they excelled, because it felt like bragging. In my world, it's about appreciating what you are good at already. So people go into situations where they want to solve a problem and they just focus on the problem. If we've got a full picture of reality, if we look at what is going really well as well, we've got all the information we need in order to solve the problem. And that was the point of that first question. And also it got people warmed up. So it was an appreciative question where they were talking about something positive, and it got warmed up to the idea of making their contribution. So it was the first point in the session where they spoke. And it had been the warm-up question as well in their pre-work. So they kind of knew what was coming. So some really interesting insights around that, but particularly that one around the discomfort of saying what we're good at. And yet that's such a powerful thing to know as an organisation, because it gives you that scope to build on what you are good at rather than just solve the problems all the time. So that was where we started, and you'll see the customer and the measure symbols were the 2 symbols that I focused on for that. People broke into pairs, so we did it in Microsoft Teams, so people went off into breakout rooms. And actually, even though we're well into the pandemic territory now, that was the first time that some of them had been into a breakout room. And it created a huge amount of energy, because people were excited to see which brilliant human they were going to be put with. The big boss was in one of them, in one of the sessions, so people were slightly intimidated by the fact they were going to be with the managing director. But it did create some energy and bring different perspectives together. But we've all had to get used to that sort of the breakout room scenario, but it's not something that they routinely use in their organisation, so it's quite different for them. Now next in our story is mapping the customer journey. So although the business didn't fit exactly into this model, it was possible to describe it in such a way that they were comfortable that they could see that yellow line that goes across the middle of the screen. They could really see that that's what happened to the customer, that they were made aware of their services, that there was some kind of exploration of what the problem was and what solution they could provide, and some contracting and some sales process. Then there was a delivery and operations element, and then there was some care at the end, and hopefully people kept going around in a circle because they had such a positive experience. And that certainly is the case with this organisation. The bulk of their business is repeat business. So I got them to identify that and agree that that was pretty much what their organisation looked like. But next in our step was to then get them to describe where they sat in this picture. So this is where, if you've been on the digital orientation, people were in the board and were simultaneously moving themselves around on the board to show where they sat in the story of the customer experience. So people would put themselves right in the heart of something, like that first team member, a little bit lower down, so the proximity to that yellow line was part of their storytelling. So this first one here in the marketing box, being so close to the line, was all about, well, I am regularly in face-to-face contact with the clients that we work with. But then there were others who sat outside of the kind of operational, functional business because they straddled two different areas. So they saw themselves sitting between perhaps customer care and marketing, bringing people back into the organisation and to have repeat delivery of their services. So I think the structure of Big Picture was great for getting them to articulate exactly where they sat and really getting them to think about, where do you sit? And I think the question I focused them on was, where do you add most value? One of the things that's apparent is people will often say, oh, I could fit in any of those boxes. But where do you add most value was a really good question for getting them again to focus on what is really good about what they do and getting them to pick a spot that they're happy to sit in. And this was a mixed group of people from different disciplines, so they weren't a proper team, they were disparate people from around the organisation. And then we had people like this one at the bottom who was just sat completely outside but underpinned the client experience. So that was an interesting exercise in getting people to establish where they saw themselves, because they're so focused, many of them, on the detail of the work that they do that they don't think about where they sit in the bigger picture of this. So it's super useful to get them to do that.
I'd add to that as well, Mark. It goes the other way around as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges we have or have had in the past a lot is, because there is an L&D function, managers don't see themselves as having a role in L&D. So sometimes when you've got a specialist title, there's a perception you just deal with that. I don't need to worry, you'll do it.
That's such a relevant observation, because we had, in this organisation, we had people who had the title sales director or business development manager, and therefore people assumed that they did all of that, and people didn't see themselves as having any part in the sales process, even though every day they were having ordinary transactional conversations with clients, and they were still ambassadors for the brand. They were still representing the organisation, therefore they were still selling, because they were reinforcing the fact that someone had bought that service. And they were it's that bias that we have, that confirmation bias, that did I do the right thing? Oh gosh, yes, because actually the time spent with this person here, that's been worth it, that's proven to me I made the right sales decision. So I think you're right about that role thing, and so getting people to describe where their value is, I think is really useful. So wisdom in the room was the next thing I popped up on the slide. And it ties in with what you guys have just been saying, actually, because we had fairly senior people, but from different disciplines, and there was a range of seniority, and then there were one or two people who in the structure were very junior, and they were some of the people who would avoid anything related or branded as a sales conversation because they didn't think it was their place. And one of the levelling conditions of this conversation was that we need to appreciate that everyone is capable of thinking, everyone has a unique position in this picture. So the point earlier about people putting themselves onto this template so they can see themselves, the point I made to them in the session was, you occupy a unique spot. No one sees the customer experience in the way that you do. So how valuable is your story and your experience in completing this picture so we know every aspect of that client experience? It's like looking at a beach ball. You know it's a beach ball, but every part of the beach ball is a different coloured segment. And if you're standing where I am, the beach ball looks red, yellow and blue. But if you're standing where John is, opposite me, it might look green, purple and pink, because you're seeing different stripes. But all of those stripes together make that complete beach ball. So I always make a big play of this, but there is wisdom in the room. And this is linked to the fact that we didn't describe it as a training session. In fact, it was the opposite of a training session, whatever that is. But it was a conversation to explore what was known already and to try and have some fresh thinking and see what the future might look like. And everyone's wisdom was of equal value. So it didn't matter if the managing director was there and if the business admin support person was there in the same room, they equally had valuable wisdom to share. And it meant that people felt valued from the moment that they engaged with this, once they became aware that that's how they were going to be treated. And I'm going to share with you really simply how we treated them fairly as well. But the participants were super thankful that it wasn't a training session, because there were people in that room who were skilled skilled salespeople, therefore did not want training and would have been completely disengaged and turned off. Others who would have lapped it up because they'd never had any sales training. But in terms of return on investment, if you've got expertise in your business and people who lack expertise, then it seems really simple to me that you put those two people together and suddenly there's a sharing of wisdom and expertise that is much cheaper than buying it in. Not trying to do myself a disservice, because sometimes you need people like me, but actually just sharing that wisdom across the organisation made perfect sense. And I know it's really obvious, and I'm sure you're all thinking that's really obvious, but it isn't necessarily the way that organisations behave, even though we know it to be true. So sharing the wisdom of the room was super important. Getting that shared view, getting those individual unique perspectives and comparing them together, and letting people see the differences in the way they saw things as well as the similarities. And that was a really big point in the feedback at the end, that I got to hear how my colleagues feel and realise that they have similar experiences to me. I don't feel so alone. I feel as though we're kind of in this together. So once we'd established we were going to be talking about wisdom in the room and unleashing that, the notion of turn taking was established. So it's really obvious. If you give people turns to speak and they know that they're not going to be interrupted, then people can say what they think in an unhurried, in an easeful way, and they can share their thinking. They know they've got the undivided attention of everybody else who is in that room with them. And so we established just a really simple table setting. So that 1 to 5, if there's 5 people in the room, everyone's occupying a seat at that table. And we just either went round clockwise or anti-clockwise. And the predictability of that really helped people to be heard. So within that, there's also equality of time. So people are required to share the time as equally as possible. So there'll always be in a group someone who's really expressive and has a lot of words to say, whereas you have those people who are less expressive, who can articulate their point in fewer words. This allows for both of those, but restricts their participation to some extent. So you end up with people being really succinct and to the point, because they're not given endless airtime. So this made a massive difference. And in the groundwork that they did beforehand, I'd explained about this. So they came in really clear about what was going to happen to them, and that we would take turns and there would be equality because of that, and the promise that I won't interrupt. So I'm a time to think coach and facilitator, so I bring my knowledge and experience of Nancy Klein's work into these things. It's that combination of big picture and the thinking environment, I guess. But that promise that you won't be interrupted is hugely powerful when it comes to people thinking well, thinking for themselves, thinking as themselves, thinking for themselves. Because you just got no sense of being on the hurry up when that happens. And also it allows people to go to the very edge of their thinking, because you don't, as much as you think you can anticipate what someone is going to say, what if the thing they were going to say never gets said, and yet it was the most powerful and impactful and game-changing few words that were expressed? And yet, because we're kind of used to interrupting each other all the time, we miss out on that so much. So this was a really slow environment. It was calm, it was measured, and it was really different for people because they're so used to working in a fast-paced environment, back-to-back meetings, no time to think, and their opinions, and they don't really get a chance to explore what they think They're just expected to come up with answers and solutions all the time. Well, when do they get that time to think about what the answers and solutions might be? There's no time to explore, and this was that time for them to explore. So that really built a real nice sort of microculture within this session. It was what I've described when I was thinking about this was it was a thoughtfully energetic environment. So even though it was calm, and you think sometimes the energy comes from the pace of what you do, but actually the calmness made it energetic, because people were hanging on everyone's words to hear where they might go with their thinking. And actually for the most senior person, I should say, in the organisation, this was massive. Because when you are senior, people defer to you, so they are happy, or they allow you to interrupt them. And it's this guy's one of his worst habits, he said. And the big takeaway for him from this was, I've really enjoyed not interrupting. I'm really glad you asked me not to, and I'm really going to try and do things differently. And he said that in front of people who report to him. So in terms of creating permission in an environment where people are going to behave differently, but the whole point of listening was not to do with that interaction in that group internally, but it was about listening to customers. So by building it into the experience that they had and letting them recognise the value, they noticed intellectually that they weren't very good at listening. And it was because they were always trying to provide the right answer, to provide the solution, to move the client on, to help them and to look knowledgeable, and to demonstrate value. But actually the point about listening came through really strongly in their feedback, because they hadn't considered just how poor they were at doing that. And they wanted to amplify that and sort of ramp it up quite a bit. So in the questions, we talked about challenges and opportunities, but I got people to walk through the customer journey in their minds. So if you imagine from the moment they discover you even exist to the point where you've served them and you're now caring for them in the hope that they come back, what are the highlights and lowlights of that experience? What are the challenges and the opportunities? There's no point in being dishonest around this, but also people will see it from their own unique perspective, which was many and varied in this case. And people were brutally honest. People weren't critical of other people's services, but they were critical of their own, but also appreciative and admired their own services and what they did. But that opportunity to say, I don't think we get that quite right, so we're not very good at that proposal stage. Our opportunity is to really tighten up the time scale, to have a standard template, to do whatever. They thought about the pragmatic ways of solving that problem, and they did it together. So when one person raised something, even if it was controversial, I think it gave others permission to support it and to tell the truth. And after the first session, so there were 6 of these, so when I got the next group together, I deliberately asked a question after I'd done this section where I said, what is more true than what you've got so far, or what truth has not been put on here? And that was really powerful, because people started to say stuff. They felt like they had permission because they got to know each other and they were comfortable with me by sort of minute 100 in the 2-hour session. So they were quite happy to say, well, actually, I think the senior team need to do. So it got a little bit more critical then, which was good. So people definitely felt that honesty. And it's because of the conditions, and it's because of what they could see building in front of them, and it's because of the experience they were having that was making them feel that they could speak up. And it was loads of little micro human behaviours, like I was saying earlier, where people were supporting the comments of more junior people in the group. And encouraging that and using them as examples, because in all of this people were disappearing off into breakout rooms, then coming back, and it gave the more senior people an opportunity to say, actually, I was just in a room with this person who was evidently more junior, and they were saying this and it was really good. I really enjoyed hearing them talk about that, and it was a real surprise, and they were very brave, and whatever they said. So it was really levelling, actually. The other thing about levelling is, I don't know to what extent you've experienced this, these environments are really levelling, because no one gets to sit at the head of the table. No one's got a bigger chair than anyone else. We're all in the same size windows. And interestingly, that was an observation that came out in terms of their learning, is that actually we feel more equal because we're in a Zoom environment, or in a Teams environment in this case. So we feel more equal because we're all the same size. I can see in your house, I can see what you've got on the wall behind you. It made not your house, John. It made people feel a little bit more equal because the signal was that they were equal. So I think there were a lot of things about the environment, the physical, technical environment, that made it feel better, made it feel more equal. So walking that line revealed loads of stuff that was perfect and less perfect, things they could build on, things they loved about the organisation, things that really bothered them. And actually the directors got really excited because I was only halfway through when they started to say, can you tell us what the outputs are from the conversations, because we want to build it into the strategic plan, because they could see what the quality of the output was just from the first 3 conversations. So 6 hours of conversation, and so much came out, they were getting really giddy. And so next, I mentioned about truth already, just saying that, well, what is the truth that's missing off here? What is more true than that? Really gave people permission. I love the question about truth, because people skirt around it, don't they? Don't want to say what the truth is. Well, the truth is, I don't like that, don't like this isn't working right. So what is true? Just say it, because this was an opportunity where people may as well speak their version of the truth, and people are still guarded and careful about what they say. The whole point of these sessions was actually to get people to think for themselves. And what was really apparent was then that although this group of people are always required to think, because they're always trying to solve problems, they're always trying to search for the next thing that is going to create the next opportunity, they're trying to fix and create all the time. But they don't take that time to think that I was mentioning earlier. And in getting people to think for themselves and as themselves, there was a real sense of actual enjoyment that came from that. So much of the feedback at the end was about appreciating the wealth of knowledge, about hearing other people's views, about it's quite exciting to spend time thinking rather than doing. And actually there's lovely feedback about big picture around great for being able to hold quite complex problems, because it's difficult sometimes to get your head around some of these things and see how they all fit together. It's good to have time to think, good to have time to reflect. So people really value the thinking, and yet there is guilt associated with thinking, which I think is a real problem, because if people are not doing the work, so I noticed this much more in corporate organisations, if I'm not seen to be doing something or producing something tangible, it's not valuable. And yet the quality of everything we do depends on the quality of the thinking that we do first. So all the thinking that was done around shaping the solution with the business, with the project sponsors for this, all the thinking that was done about the questions, and shaping the environment, all of that thinking created the experience. So I think one of our challenges as L&D and folk and people interested in people and helping them to improve is how to get people to feel less guilty about thinking, to recognise the work is thinking, and building that in, and never feeling that that's a waste, because of course we've been conditioned to think that, if we're staring into the middle distance, thinking about something really important, then we're daydreaming and there's no value in that. But of course there's huge value in that if we're dreaming up a new solution to a problem. So I wanted to give you a bit of an idea of how I've measured the success of this. So you'll see there's a treasure box at the right hand end of my page. It's been there the whole time. I'm going to reveal that because I said we were focused on challenges, but we were trying to reveal the opportunities, uncovering opportunities. And in these sessions, we revealed 103 opportunities that people felt that actually, even though this wasn't a training session, they identified opportunities, they came up with them. So straight away, rather than me saying, well, now you know how to listen to your clients better, what are you going to do? I didn't have to do any of that stuff, because they'd said, actually, I'm going to have a slightly different conversation with my customer and it's going to be like this, because it was all their own solutions. It was their flash of inspiration and insight, not mine as the facilitator. It came from their conversation and the space that they had in their heads to think for those 2 hours. So really powerful in terms of the number of opportunities, and it's those opportunities, not all 103 of them, I dare say, that got woven into the strategic plan for the business for the next 5 years. And when you look at that picture now, it's really childlike, isn't it? And really simplistic, and yet that got woven into a strategic plan, which I just think is incredible. But people loved it. I've already shared some of the anecdotal feedback with you. People absolutely loved the experience of thinking, and big picture was the way in which I was able to really create that space where people could huddle around it, as well as using Microsoft Teams really well, so people were in and out and excited about who they were going to meet. So it's that combination of getting people excited that I know before 3 of you were talking about, you know, people who don't want to be there and all of that. We managed with this to create an environment where people wanted to be there, or if they didn't want to be there, very quickly they did when they were in it. The final bit that pops up on here is just, do you have any questions, and what fresh thinking do you have about this now that I have shared it with you and spent far more minutes on it than I'm supposed to? I'm going to stop sharing my slide so I can see your faces.